Sarah Mitchell's day had been longer than usual. The clock on her car's dashboard showed 11:30 p.m. as she drove home from her law office in downtown Atlanta. The streets were quiet, and the only light came from the street lamps and the occasional passing car. She had spent extra hours preparing for an important case, something that wasn't unusual for a dedicated corporate attorney like herself. The radio played soft jazz as she carefully followed the speed limit, knowing that late-night drives often meant increased police presence. Her black Mercedes was spotless, her license and registration were up to date, and she had no reason to worry. Yet, there was always that small knot in her stomach whenever she drove alone at night. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Sarah checked her speed again, exactly at the limit. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, positioning her car properly by the curb. Years of experience had taught her exactly what to do in these situations. She turned off the music, rolled down her window halfway, turned on the interior light, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Two officers approached her car, one on each side. Their flashlights beamed through her windows, much brighter than necessary. Sarah remained calm, her heart beating steady despite the situation. She could hear them chuckling before they even reached her car. Well, the officer on the driver's side said, his voice carrying an unmistakable tone of amusement. What do we have here? He shined his flashlight directly into her face, even though the car's interior light was already on. Good evening, officer, Sarah replied politely, keeping her voice steady and professional. May I ask why I've been pulled over? The second officer, standing by the passenger window, let out a short laugh. Fancy car for this neighborhood, isn't it? He ignored her question completely. Sarah's hand moved slowly, deliberately. Officer, I'm reaching for my phone to record this interaction, and then I'll get my license and registration. She narrated her movements clearly, just as she advised her own clients to do. Oh, look at that, Mike, the first officer said to his partner. She knows her rights. Probably one of those social media lawyers. Both officers laughed again, sharing a look over the roof of her car. Sarah started recording on her phone, placing it on the dashboard. I'm actually a corporate attorney with Anderson and Blake Law Firm downtown. I'm coming from my office after preparing for tomorrow's case. A lawyer? The officer's voice dripped with skepticism. And I'm the president. More laughter followed. Sarah maintained her composure as she carefully retrieved her license and registration from her purse. Her hands didn't shake as she handed them over. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The first officer took his time examining her documents, holding them up to his flashlight, even though he could clearly see them in the car's interior light. Anderson and Blake, cleaning staff must be working late tonight. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. Officer, I've identified myself and provided my documents. Could you please tell me why I was pulled over? Your tint looks a bit dark, the first officer said, though her windows were factory standard. And you were driving. Suspiciously. Suspiciously, Sarah repeated, making sure her phone was still recording. Could you please explain what you mean by suspicious driving? The second officer tapped the roof of her car. You're driving too perfectly. Nobody drives that carefully unless they're hiding something. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of anger and exhaustion, but her face showed nothing. So I was pulled over for following traffic laws correctly. The officers exchanged another laugh. Getting smart with us, are you? The first officer asked, his amusement barely hiding his irritation at her composed responses. No, sir. I'm simply trying to understand the reason for this stop. Sarah knew every word. Every interaction was being recorded. Her phone caught their dismissive tones, their laughter, their assumptions. After what seemed like an eternity of unnecessary questions and thinly veiled insults, the first officer finally handed back her documents. We'll let you off with a warning this time. Drive less suspiciously. As they walked away, Sarah could hear them still chuckling, making comments just loud enough for her to hear. She waited until they had driven away before letting out a long breath. Looking at her phone, she confirmed that everything had been recorded. Not this time, she whispered to herself, saving the video file. This wasn't going to be just another incident to forget about. This time, things would be different. The next morning, Sarah walked into her law office earlier than usual. She hadn't slept much after the incident, her mind replaying the officers' laughing faces over and over. Her office, with its wall of law books and certificates, felt different today, like a reminder of everything she had worked for and everything she needed to fight for. She started her computer and transferred the video from her phone. The recording was clear, capturing every word, every laugh, and every dismissive gesture from the officers. Sarah played it 3 times, taking detailed notes. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote, not from fear but from determination. At 8:30 a.m., her colleague James knocked on her door. "You're in early," he said, then noticed her serious expression. "Everything okay?" Sarah turned her computer screen towards him. "Watch this." She played the video again. James's friendly smile disappeared as he watched. When it finished, he sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. "Sarah, this is bad, really bad. Those officers, they didn't even try to hide their prejudice." "It gets worse," Sarah said, turning her laptop to show him a webpage. "I did some digging this morning. These officers, Mike Peterson and Tom Richards, they have 3 other complaints filed against them, all from black drivers, all dismissed due to lack of evidence." James leaned forward, his legal mind already working. "You're going to file a complaint?" "More than that." Sarah opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "I'm going to the police department's internal affairs division today, but I'm also preparing a civil rights case. Those other complaints, I've already reached out to 2 of the drivers. They're willing to talk." Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Are you sure about this, baby? These things have a way of following you." Sarah showed the message to James, who understood her mother's worry. Many lawyers, especially black lawyers, hesitated to challenge law enforcement directly. It could affect their careers, their safety, even their families. "I have to do this," Sarah said, more to herself than to James. "If I don't stand up now, with all my education and resources, then who will?" Later that morning, Sarah walked into the police department building. She wore her best suit, carried her most professional briefcase, and held her head high. The desk sergeant looked up as she approached. "I need to file a formal complaint with Internal Affairs," Sarah said, her voice clear and confident. The sergeant's expression didn't change. "Fill this out." He pushed a form across the desk. "Someone will contact you in 5 to 7 business days." "Actually," Sarah replied, placing her business card on the desk, "I need to speak with Lieutenant Rodriguez in Internal Affairs today. She's expecting me." The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly at her law firm's name on the card. He made a call, speaking in low tones. A few minutes later, a woman in a crisp uniform appeared. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez. Please follow me." In the lieutenant's office, Sarah played the video. Rodriguez watched without expression, but her eyes narrowed at certain points. When it finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Miss Mitchell, I'd apologize for your experience. We'll conduct a thorough investigation." "With all due respect, Lieutenant," Sarah replied, opening her briefcase, "I have documentation of 3 similar incidents involving these same officers. All complaints were dismissed. I'm not here just to file another complaint. I'm here to ensure actual change happens." She pulled out copies of the previous complaints, news articles about police discrimination, and statistics about traffic stops in the area. Rodriguez's eyes widened slightly at the thoroughness of Sarah's preparation. "I should mention," Sarah added, her voice professional but firm, "that I've already spoken with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. They're very interested in patterns of discriminatory behavior in traffic stops." As she left the police department an hour later, Sarah's phone buzzed again. A text from James. "Channel 4 News saw your video. They want to talk. You ready for this?" Sarah looked back at the police building, thinking about the officers' laughter, about her mother's worry, about all the people who couldn't fight back the way she could. "Ready," she texted back. This was just the beginning, and Sarah Mitchell was prepared for the long fight ahead. The Channel 4 News studio was colder than Sarah expected. She sat under bright lights as the makeup artist made final touches to her face. In the past week, her video had spread across social media like wildfire, gaining millions of views. Now, she was about to tell her story to the whole city. 3 minutes until we're live, a producer called out. Sarah checked her phone one last time. There were dozens of messages, some from old law school friends, others from strangers who had faced similar discrimination. But one message caught her eye. It was from Marcus Thompson, head of the Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund. "You've started something important," his message read. "Let's meet tomorrow. This is bigger than one traffic stop." The red light on the camera blinked on. The news anchor, Lisa Chen, smiled warmly. "Tonight, we have with us Sarah Mitchell, a corporate attorney whose recent encounter with police has raised serious questions about racial profiling in our city." Sarah spoke clearly and confidently, just as she did in court. She described the traffic stop, the officer's behavior, and her discovery of similar incidents. But then she said something that wasn't in the planned interview. "This isn't just about two officers who laughed at the wrong person," Sarah said, looking directly into the camera. "This is about a system that made them feel comfortable enough to laugh at all." After the interview, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. More people came forward with stories. Her email inbox filled up with messages from other Black professionals, doctors, teachers, business owners, all sharing similar experiences. The next morning, Sarah met Marcus Thompson in his office downtown. The walls were covered with framed newspaper articles about civil rights victories. He didn't waste time with small talk. "We've been gathering data for months," Marcus said, spreading files across his desk. "Traffic stop statistics, complaint records, body camera footage. Your case could be the key to exposing everything." Sarah looked through the files. The numbers were shocking. Black drivers were 5 times more likely to be stopped in certain precincts. Complaints about racial profiling were routinely buried or dismissed. "The department will try to settle this quietly," Marcus warned. "They'll offer you money, maybe even promise to suspend those officers, but that won't fix the real problem." Sarah thought about the messages she'd received, about all the people who hadn't been able to fight back. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A class action lawsuit," Marcus replied. "Not just against those 2 officers, but against the entire department. Challenge their training, their policies, their complaint system. Force real change." It was a huge decision. Taking on the entire police department would make her a target. It could affect her career, her safety, maybe even her family's safety. Some of her law firm's clients might not want to work with someone involved in such a controversial case. Sarah's phone buzzed. Another message from her mother. "Just saw your interview. Your father would have been so proud. Do what you need to do, baby." Her father had been a civil rights activist in the 1980s. He had always taught her that having power meant having responsibility. Now, sitting in Marcus's office, she could almost hear his voice. "If we do this," Sarah said slowly, "we need to do it right. No shortcuts. No settling. We go all the way." Marcus smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." He pulled out more files. "We have 8 other plaintiffs ready to join, with your video and their stories, plus our data." "We need more," Sarah interrupted. "I want to investigate their training programs, get their internal communications, look into every complaint filed in the last 5 years." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city she'd called home her entire life. "They thought it was funny when I said I was a lawyer. Let's show them just how serious a lawyer can be." Marcus watched her with growing respect. "You know they'll fight back hard. The police union, the department, maybe even some politicians." Sarah turned back from the window, her decision made. "Good, because I plan to fight harder. Call your plaintiffs. Set up the meetings. It's time to show those officers that their laughter came at a very high price." 2 months after her decision to file a class action lawsuit, Sarah's office looked like a war room. Papers covered every surface, and a large whiteboard displayed a complex timeline of events. She had taken a leave of absence from her corporate law position to focus entirely on this case. On her desk, a new stack of documents arrived each morning. Today's pile included police training manuals, internal memos, and complaint records that had taken weeks of legal pressure to obtain. Sarah picked up one of the training documents and frowned at what she read. A knock on her door interrupted her concentration. It was Marcus Thompson, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a worried expression. "You need to see this," he said, placing a USB drive on her desk. "One of our sources inside the department just sent it. It's dashcam footage from the last 3 years." Sarah plugged in the drive and started watching. Her heart sank as video after video showed the same pattern. Officers Peterson and Richards targeting black drivers, making jokes, conducting unnecessary searches. But it wasn't just them. Other officers showed similar behavior. Look at the dates, Marcus pointed out. The department knew about this for years. They had the footage but ignored it. Sarah made notes as they watched. How many videos are there? Over 200, Marcus replied. But that's not all. He pulled out his phone and played a recording. It was from a police radio channel, capturing officers joking about their traffic stops, using racist language when they thought nobody was listening. Just then, Sarah's phone rang. It was Lisa Chen from Channel 4 News. Miss Mitchell, Lisa said urgently, we've been contacted by a former police trainer. He says he was fired 3 years ago after complaining about discriminatory practices in the training program. He wants to talk, but only to you. An hour later, Sarah sat in a quiet coffee shop with James Wilson, the former police trainer. His hands shook slightly as he spoke. I tried to change things from the inside, he explained, pushing a folder across the table. I documented everything. The way they trained officers to profile certain neighborhoods, certain types of cars, how they taught them to find excuses for stops. When I complained, they said I was too soft, then they fired me. Sarah opened the folder. Inside were training schedules, lesson plans, and internal emails that clearly showed a pattern of biased practices. Why come forward now? She asked. James looked down at his coffee. I saw your interview. You reminded me of why I became a police trainer in the first place, to make things better. I've been carrying this guilt for 3 years. Maybe now it can finally help make a change. Back in her office that evening, Sarah and Marcus reviewed everything they had gathered. The videos, the training documents, the radio recordings, the statistical data showing racial disparities in traffic stops. It was overwhelming. We have enough, Marcus said. More than enough. But Sarah wasn't satisfied. We need to talk to more officers. There must be others like James who want to do the right thing. As if on cue, her email pinged. It was from an anonymous police officer using a secure email service. The message was brief. There are 5 of us who want to testify. We're tired of staying silent. Sarah immediately called her security team. Since the case had grown, she had received threats and needed protection. But these officers would need even more protection to testify against their own department. Set up a secure meeting, she told Marcus. We need to hear their stories. Later that night, as Sarah prepared to leave her office, she noticed a new comment on the viral video of her traffic stop. It was from a young black law student. You're showing us that we can fight back. Thank you. Sarah thought about how a simple traffic stop had unveiled so much more. The laughter of those officers had opened a door, and behind it lay years of systematic discrimination waiting to be exposed. Her phone buzzed with another text from her mother. Baby, be careful, but don't stop. Sarah looked at the mountain of evidence on her desk. No stopping now, she whispered to herself. The truth was finally coming to light, and she was ready to make sure everyone saw it. The morning sun hadn't risen yet when Sarah's phone started ringing. It was 5:30 a.m., and her story had just hit the national news. The video of her traffic stop, combined with the evidence she had gathered, was now playing on every major network. Turn on your TV, Marcus said when she answered. It's everywhere. Sarah switched on her television and watched as news anchors across different channels discussed her case. The headline on one channel read, Systematic Discrimination Exposed in Atlanta Police Department. Another showed, Brave Attorney Uncovers Years of Police Misconduct. Her doorbell rang. Outside, 3 news vans were already parked on her street. Reporters stood with their cameras, waiting. Sarah took a deep breath and called her security team. Ms. Mitchell, the reporters called out as she walked to her car. What made you decide to take on the entire police department? Have you received threats? What do you say to those who claim you're attacking law enforcement? She had been prepared for attention, but not like this. Her phone kept buzzing with messages, some supportive, others angry and threatening. One message made her stop and stare. We know where you live. Drop the case or else. At the office, Marcus was waiting with more news. The police union is fighting back, he said, showing her their official statement. They claimed Sarah was anti-police and creating division in the community. But then something unexpected happened. A group of black police officers from different precincts held their own press conference. What Ms. Mitchell has uncovered isn't just about 2 officers laughing. Officer James Carter, a 20-year veteran, said on live TV. It's about a culture that needs to change. We support her efforts to make our department better. Sarah watched the press conference with tears in her eyes. She hadn't expected support from within the police force itself. By afternoon, her email was flooded with messages from across the country. Black lawyers, doctors, business owners, all sharing similar stories of discrimination. But one email caught her attention. It was from Judge Patricia Thompson, one of the few black female judges in the state. "Stay strong," the judge wrote. 20 years ago, I faced similar discrimination. We need people like you to keep fighting. Don't let them intimidate you. The pressure was intense. Some of her law firm's clients started pulling their business, worried about being associated with controversy. Anonymous callers kept trying to dig up dirt from her past. Someone even spray-painted threats on her garage door. But for every act of intimidation, there were 10 acts of support. Local community groups organized rallies. Law students offered to volunteer their time to help with research. Other attorneys offered their services pro bono. That evening, Sarah sat in a community center, surrounded by other victims of police discrimination. They had come to share their stories, to be part of the lawsuit. "They laughed at me too," an elderly man said, his voice shaking. "Made me feel less than human. But nobody would listen before. You made them listen." A young woman spoke next. "They stopped me 3 times in 1 month. Each time, they acted like I couldn't possibly own the car I was driving. But I was too scared to complain. Not anymore." As Sarah listened to their stories, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Officers Peterson and Richards' supervisor requesting a private meeting. He wanted to share some information. "It's probably a trap," Marcus warned when she told him. "Or it's another crack in their wall," Sarah replied. "Set up the meeting, but with our security present." Late that night, as Sarah finally headed home, she passed the spot where she'd been pulled over. The officer's laughter still echoed in her memory, but it didn't hurt anymore. Instead, it fueled her determination. Her mother called just before she went to bed. "I saw you on the news all day," she said. "Your father would be so proud. But baby, are you sure you're ready for all this?" Sarah looked at the pile of supporting messages on her desk, thought about all the stories she'd heard that day. "They started this by laughing at the wrong person," she said. "I'm going to finish it by making sure they never laugh at anyone like that again." The meeting with the police supervisor changed everything. John Martinez, a 25-year veteran of the force, brought with him a USB drive containing years of hidden complaints and evidence of systematic discrimination. His hand shook as he handed it over. "I've been collecting this for years," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I thought I could change things from the inside. But after seeing what you're doing, I realize we need outside pressure too." Sarah and Marcus spent the next 3 days reviewing the new evidence. What they found was shocking. Internal memos showing how complaints were buried, training materials that encouraged racial profiling, and performance reviews that rewarded aggressive stopping tactics in minority neighborhoods. But Sarah wasn't interested in just winning a lawsuit anymore. She had a bigger plan. "We need to turn this into real change," she told Marcus one morning. "Not just punishments, but actual reforms." That afternoon, Sarah called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and concerned citizens. Camera flashes lit up the room as she stepped to the podium. "Today, I'm announcing the creation of the Equal Justice Initiative," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. "This won't be just another lawsuit. We're building a movement for lasting change." She outlined her plan, a new organization that would focus on police reform, community engagement, and legal support for victims of discrimination. The lawsuit money wouldn't just go to the victims. It would fund programs to improve police training and community relations. "We don't want to destroy the police department," she explained. "We want to make it better. For everyone." The response was immediate. Donations started pouring in. Law firms offered office space. Civil rights organizations pledged support. Even some police officers quietly reached out, wanting to help create better training programs. Sarah started visiting law schools, speaking to young black students about standing up for justice. After one such talk, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "I almost quit law school last year," the student said. "The pressure, the discrimination, It felt too hard, but seeing you fight back gave me strength to continue. The movement grew bigger than Sarah had ever imagined. Community meetings that once attracted dozens now drew hundreds. Police officers began attending voluntarily, wanting to be part of the solution. One evening, Sarah visited a youth center in a low-income neighborhood. Kids gathered around her, eager to hear her story. They laughed at me because they thought I couldn't be a lawyer, she told them. But instead of getting angry, I used their laughter to fuel change. A small boy raised his hand. My dad got stopped by police last week. He was scared. Will your new rules make it better? Sarah knelt down to his level. That's exactly what we're working for, she said. And one day, maybe you'll be a lawyer too, helping make things even better. The Equal Justice Initiative's first major victory came when the police department agreed to mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, and body cameras for all officers, but Sarah pushed for more. She worked with police academy instructors to develop new training modules. She helped create a community feedback system where citizens could rate their interactions with officers. She even started a scholarship program for minority students interested in law enforcement careers. Officers Peterson and Richards, the ones who had laughed at her that night, were now required to attend these training sessions. They sat in the back row, quiet and uncomfortable, as Sarah taught about the impact of discriminatory practices. This isn't about revenge, she told Marcus when he asked about having her former harassers in the training. It's about education and change. Late one night, as Sarah was leaving her office, she found a letter on her desk. It was from Officer Peterson's teenage daughter. Thank you, the letter read. My dad came home from your training different. He's talking about things he never talked about before. He's learning. You didn't just get back at him, you helped make him better. Sarah smiled as she read the letter. The laughter that had once hurt her had become a catalyst for real change. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't punishment, but transformation. 1 year after starting the Equal Justice Initiative, Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the organization's accomplishments. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings and thank you letters from community members. Her phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. Turn on the news, Marcus texted. Judge Williams is retiring. Sarah switched on the TV. Judge Robert Williams, one of the most respected judges in the state court, had announced his early retirement. He had served for 30 years and was known for his fairness and integrity. Later that day, Sarah's phone rang. It was Patricia Thompson, the black female judge who had supported her during the lawsuit. Sarah, Judge Thompson said warmly, we need to talk about something important. Have you ever considered becoming a judge? Sarah almost dropped her phone. A judge? Me? Why not you? Judge Thompson replied. You've shown incredible legal knowledge, ethics, and courage. The state needs judges who understand real-world discrimination and how to fight it fairly. The idea kept Sarah awake that night. She thought about all the cases she'd seen, all the people who needed a fair voice in the system. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes you have to be the change you want to see. The next morning, a group of community leaders and legal professionals gathered in her office. They had already started organizing support for her nomination. You've earned this, Marcus told her. Your work has changed lives. Imagine what you could do from the bench. But not everyone supported the idea. Some police union members openly opposed her. Anonymous online posts called her anti-law enforcement and too activist to be a judge. Sarah decided to address these concerns directly. She scheduled meetings with police officers, including critics of her work. In one memorable meeting, she sat down with veteran officers who had initially opposed her reforms. I'm not against law enforcement, she explained. I'm for justice. For everyone, including officers who want to do their jobs right. Her honest approach worked. More officers started supporting her nomination. Even some who had disagreed with her methods acknowledged her fairness and integrity. The nomination process was intense. Sarah had to share every detail of her career, every case she'd handled. Her work with the Equal Justice Initiative came under special scrutiny. During her judicial nomination hearing, one senator asked, Ms. Mitchell, some say your experience with those officers has made you biased against law enforcement. How do you respond? Sarah stood tall as she answered. That experience taught me the importance of fairness and looking at evidence, not assumptions. I've worked with good officers who want change. As a judge, I would treat everyone equally under the law, civilians and law enforcement alike. Support came from unexpected places. The police academy invited her to speak about legal ethics. Community groups organized rallies. Local businesses displayed "Support Sarah Mitchell" signs. Even more surprising, several reformed officers from her training program spoke up for her. Officer Martinez, the supervisor who had helped expose the discrimination, testified about her fairness and commitment to justice. One evening, as Sarah prepared for another interview, her mother visited her office. She brought an old photo of Sarah's father at a civil rights rally in the 1980s. "He always said you'd do great things," her mother said, tears in her eyes. But I don't think even he imagined his daughter might become a judge. The nomination process stretched on for weeks. Sarah continued her work at the initiative while preparing for numerous interviews and hearings. Her phone kept buzzing with messages of support from across the country. Then came the final hearing. The room was packed. Officers Peterson and Richards, who had once laughed at her, watched from the back row as Sarah answered the final questions with confidence and dignity. As she walked out of the hearing, a young black girl stopped her. "My mom says you might be our new judge," the girl said. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. "You can be anything you want," she said. "And maybe someday you'll sit on an even higher bench than I will." That night, Sarah stood at her office window, looking out at the city she had worked so hard to change. The path from a traffic stop to a judge's nomination had been long and hard. But every step, every challenge, had prepared her for this moment. 3 years had passed since that fateful traffic stop. Today, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her new black judicial robe. The golden nameplate on her desk read "Judge Sarah Mitchell." Her mother helped smooth out the robe's shoulders, tears of pride in her eyes. "Your father would have loved to see this," her mother whispered, touching the robe's sleeve gently. Sarah's first day as a judge was about to begin. The morning news had announced her historic appointment. She was one of the youngest black female judges in the state's history. But today wasn't about making history. It was about serving justice. As she walked into the courthouse, familiar faces greeted her. Security officers who had once been skeptical of her reforms now nodded respectfully. Law clerks smiled warmly. Her old friend Marcus waited outside her chambers with a small gift, a gavel that had belonged to Judge Thompson, her mentor. "She wanted you to have this," Marcus said, handing her the polished wooden gavel. She said it brought her luck in making fair decisions. Sarah's first few cases were routine: traffic violations, small claims, minor disputes. She handled each one with care and attention, remembering how it felt to stand before authority feeling powerless and afraid. Then, just before lunch break, an unexpected case appeared on her docket. Officer Mike Peterson, one of the officers who had laughed at her that night, stood before her court. He was facing a disciplinary hearing for misconduct during a traffic stop. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone knew their history. Sarah could see the shock on Peterson's face as he recognized her. His lawyer quickly approached the bench. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "given your history with my client, perhaps you should recuse yourself from this case." Sarah looked at Officer Peterson. The man who had laughed at her now stood nervously, avoiding her gaze. She thought about the letter his daughter had written, about the changes he had started to make after attending her training programs. "You're right," Sarah said calmly. "I will recuse myself to ensure complete fairness. But before I do," she paused, making sure to meet Peterson's eyes, "I want to remind everyone in this court that justice works best when we see each other's humanity, when we look past our assumptions and biases." Peterson's face reddened as he finally looked up at her. Recognition, shame, and something like respect crossed his features. As she left the courtroom, Sarah heard whispers of amazement at her handling of the situation. She had shown that justice wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness and dignity. Later that afternoon, Sarah presided over a case involving a young black woman who had been wrongly accused of shoplifting. The evidence was flimsy, based mainly on the security guard's suspicions. "Case dismissed," Sarah announced firmly. "And let the record show that suspicion without evidence is not grounds for arrest or prosecution." The young woman burst into tears of relief. As she left the courtroom, she mouthed, "Thank you to Sarah." At the end of her first day, Sarah sat in her chambers, holding Judge Thompson's gavel. Her phone was full of congratulatory messages, including one from her old law firm. But the message that touched her most came from an unexpected source. Judge Mitchell. The message read, "My dad was wrong that night. You weren't just a lawyer, you were a force for change. Thank you for showing us a better way. Amy Peterson, Officer Peterson's daughter." Sarah smiled, remembering the laughter that had once hurt her so deeply. Now it seemed distant, like a storm that had cleared the way for a brighter day. That evening, as she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed a young black girl watching her from the courthouse hallway. The girl's mother was filling out legal papers nearby. "Are you really the judge?" the girl asked in awe. "Yes, I am," Sarah replied, kneeling to the girl's level. "And you know what? This robe is just a reminder that justice is for everyone. Maybe someday you'll wear one too." The girl's eyes lit up. "They won't laugh at me?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "And if they do, remember this, sometimes their laughter is just the beginning of a story that ends with you rising higher than they ever imagined." Walking out of the courthouse, Sarah looked back at the building where she would now serve justice. The memory of that traffic stop, of those laughing officers, had transformed from a wound into a victory. She had turned their mockery into a movement, their discrimination into determination, and their laughter into a legacy of change.